Hey everybody, Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here today with our 2017 F150. Overall, for what you get as far as on-road performance is concerned, the 6-inch SuperLift kit is a pretty solid buy. You're going to save yourself some money over the more expensive kits, and you'll get a pretty similar on-road ride to any other system on the market. With the SuperLift being more affordable than some of the other competitors, you get a pretty decent bang for your buck. For this SuperLift install, you will definitely need to have the truck in the air and preferably on a lift. Remove the front and rear wheels to start off. Now underneath the truck, remove all the splash guards that cover up the underside. There is also a metal skid plate covering up the steering box to remove. With that out of the way, we can remove both the electrical connectors on the steering box module. At the front suspension, remove the dust cover, revealing the axle nut that can be removed. Then work your way to the vacuum and brake lines on the side of the frame and knuckle. The outer tie rod can be removed from the knuckle next and set aside. A hammer might be needed to break it loose from the knuckle. At the upper control arm, loosen the knuckle connection, but leave the nut threaded on a couple threads for now. The caliper can now be removed from the knuckle and hung on the side to not stress the brake lines. We removed the caliper and caliper brackets separately, but you can remove them as an entire unit if you choose. Then the rotor can slide off the hub. Remove the brake shield from the knuckle. It has 3 small bolts. Then go behind the hub and remove the 1 bolt that holds the ABS sensor in the hub. Also at the top of the axle, you can remove the vent tube that connects to the back of the vacuum module. Then remove the nut from the sway bar end link. For more room up top, we remove the dust shield above the strut tower. Loosen the control arm bolts at the frame, but do not fully remove them just yet. In the lower control arm, undo the 2 lower strut bolts to prepare to remove the strut. Now break loose the UCA from the knuckle with a couple hits from a hammer. Since we are ready to remove the knuckle, loosen the bottom nut enough to break the knuckle free, then remove the UCA nut, swing the knuckle out of the UCA, and then fully remove the lower control arm nut to take the knuckle from the truck. Now ready to remove the lower control arms, loosen the 2 frame mounts to be able to pry down and release the control arm from the coilover mount. Then you can completely remove the bolts and take out the lower control arms. And with the lower control arm out, we can remove the coilover completely by taking the nuts on the 3 bolts that come through the top of the strut tower off. Removing the sway bar is next, so loosen the bolts on the bushing mounts to slide it off the frame. Also, the lower cross member can be removed since we will not reuse it. It attaches with 2 bolts per side on the subframe. We then remove the front drive shaft from the differential by removing the 6 bolts on the end of the drive shaft. At this point, we prepared to remove the front differential by placing a jack under the pumpkin for support. Then started loosening and removing the 3 mount bolts. Once all 3 bolts are finger loose, have a friend help you support the differential while you remove the bolts by hand and remove the diff from the truck. If you have a transmission jack, it'll come in handy here. SuperLift provides detailed instructions on how to cut the frame to install the new drop brackets, so using their measurements, we measured twice and cut once. After we cut, we cleaned up the metal with a grinder. Back at our workbench, we started to transfer everything from the factory knuckles to the new extended knuckles. Remove the vacuum module and hub assembly, then reinstall them on the new knuckle in the same orientation. Make sure the teeth on the vacuum module mesh correctly with the hub when reinstalled. Now for the differential, loosely attach the driver's side front diff drop bracket to the differential. And this bracket does not have notches on top. Loosely attach the passenger side differential drop bracket to the frame using the factory hardware. The bolt will install from the front. The vent tube extension can be installed to the vent tube using the adapter and extra hose provided. Lift the differential into place and set the front driver differential bracket into the frame using the factory hardware. Install the bolt from the front, then pivot the differential into the passenger side bracket and install the bolt from the rear. Do not tighten it just yet. We had to loosen the steering rack bolt on the driver's side to help with the clearance while installing the driver's side drop bracket. Remove the factory sway bar bolts from each side and insert the new hardware for the sway bar drop brackets. Loosely tighten these bolts as well for now. With the sway bar drop brackets in place, add the rear crossmember drop bracket to the frame of the truck. Secure it to the frame using the supplied bolts, washers, and nuts. The bolts will install from the rear. Install the supplied bolt, washer, and nut from the rear through the sway bar bracket, differential mount, and rear crossmember. Do not tighten this just yet either. Take the new front crossmember and loosely install it with the factory hardware. We next bolted the lower control arms to the new crossmembers with the alignment cams. We snugged them up for now. After the control arms in place, we can start to tighten all the hardware we left loose, starting with the sway bar drop brackets, the rear crossmember mounting bolts to the frame, the differential rear mounting bolt to the rear crossmember, the front differential brackets to the frame, and differential, then lastly, the front crossmember to the frame. Now we bolted in the differential skid plate to each of the new cross members. Addressing the front drive shaft, we need to add the spacer to the differential. So add some of the supplied Loctite to the bolts before inserting the spacer to the differential. Then place the drive shaft into the spacer and secure it with the new bolts. The sway bar is ready to install to the new drop brackets with the factory nuts and bolts. When it is back on the truck, we'll then address the front strut extensions. Add the spacers to the tops of the factory coilovers and tighten them down with the factory nuts. With the lift spacers on the struts, you can replace the newly assembled coilover back into the truck's strut tower and loosely tighten the upper nuts to hold it in place. Attach the new lift knuckle to the lower control arm and thread on the nut. Now a friend might be needed to lift the knuckle and lower control arm assembly up to the lower strut bolts. Guide the lower strut bolts into the lower control arm and thread on the nuts. You can then insert the axle to the knuckle so the knuckle can attach back to the upper control arm. Replace the ABS sensor into the hub and tighten its bolt. Also bolt the axle back to the hub. Be careful not to over-tighten these. The dust shield can be replaced onto the new lift knuckle as well. Zip up the lower strut bolts, then move up top to the UCA and tighten it down to the knuckle. Then the knuckle to the lower control arm. Slip the rotor back on to be able to reattach the caliper and the caliper bracket to the hub. After tightening down the caliper, we went up to the upper 3 strut bolts and finished tightening them down. Also finished tightening the upper control arms to the frame. At the back of the hub, slip the vent tube back onto the vacuum ring on the hub. Slide the sway bar back on top of the end link connection to be able to bolt the sway bar back down. Start reattaching all of the vacuum and brake lines back to the knuckle, but we'll also add the included drop bracket to the side of the frame so that our lines are in a good position after lifting the truck. Since we're finished up top by the strut, clip the dust cover back to the wheel well liner. We replaced the outer tie rod back into the knuckle and tightened it down, as well as reconnected the steering box connectors. Lastly, for the front, we tightened back down the lower control arms to the cross members to finish the front lift install. The rear lift is much less complex than the front, and it will start with removing the shocks so we can raise and lower the rear axle with a jack as we need. After the upper and lower bolts are removed from the shock, you can take the shock out of the truck. Next, start undoing the rear block U-bolts. Be sure to have a jack supporting the axle while you do this. Once the 4 nuts are off, remove the lower plate and stock U-bolts. We then lowered the rear axle with our jack enough for us to fit the new rear block on top of the stock block under the leaf pack. The 2 alignment pins in the block will keep it centered and in place. Once you raise the axle back up, add the new longer U-bolts over the axle and slide the lower plate back on so that you can tighten the U-bolts with the new hardware. Be sure to tighten the 4 nuts evenly. We also must extend the bump stops in the rear, so remove the factory setup through the bolt in the center of the bump stop. The extension will sit on top of the factory bump stop with the new hardware. Then thread it back into the truck. We can now install our new lifted rear shocks. We find it easiest to install the top mount first, then raise or lower the rear axle to match the height of the lower mount to install that bolt. Tighten them both down and the lift kit is completely installed.